And now for our main event. We often think of technology as something bloodless, lacking in human qualities like emotion, judgment, or creativity. Eliminate those qualities and you, of course, increase efficiency and reduce any possibility of error. So I'd like to begin this introduction with an existential question. Can a technology company have a soul? Our guest speaker believes the answer is yes. In fact, when he took over Microsoft in 2014, he set out to save the company's soul, and by most accounts, he succeeded. Only 3 people in the world have run Microsoft: Bill Gates, Steve Ballmer, and our speaker tonight, Satya Nadella. Satya took the job after 2 decades with the company, during which he seemingly did everything: research, cloud technology, artificial intelligence, and more. Bill Gates was, and still is, a personal mentor of his. At a time when technology and ethics are both under increasing amounts of scrutiny, Satya has helped reshape the company's image from what some would have called a monopolistic bully to a more socially conscious corporation. While parts of the tech industry are under siege, Microsoft is quietly maintaining its edge and growing its market share. Today, it's the 4th most valuable company in the world with a market capitalization, and this is just a stunning number, of $885 billion. Stunning. Satya took over Microsoft at a time when tablets were hot and the PC was on the decline. After years of domination, there were questions about the company's direction and its ability to stay on top in the hyper-competitive tech world where rapid obsolescence is the norm. Today, those questions have stopped. Under Satya's leadership, the company has posted amazing gains as it has pivoted towards a subscription model. In fact, many would be surprised to know that Microsoft's stock price has outpaced Apple over the last 5 years. He's also introduced a culture of continuous improvement, which he described in an interview a year ago. He said Microsoft needed to switch from being a know-it-all to a learn-it-all company. That's a big shift in mindset for a company full of brilliant software engineers who could be forgiven for feeling like they'd actually reinvented the world, because they did. Satya chronicled his journey and the company's transformation in a book entitled Hit Refresh. His subtitle offers some more context. He says it's the quest to rediscover Microsoft's soul and imagine a better future for everyone. That's the book that you have on the table. At the heart of the book is the concept of empathy, which, as we know, is the ability to understand and share the feelings of another. He has applied the concept of empathy in business to help his company rediscover its soul. And just to give you a little more insight into the way he thinks, I want to share something else. He was recently at a tech conference and cited a line of poetry that inspires him. He chose a line from a poem called Imaginary Number, which reads as follows: "The soul, like the square root of -1, is an impossibility that has its uses." Okay, I don't see a lot of heads nodding. I guess I'm not getting a great deal of empathy up here. Fortunately, we have Satya here to explain tonight what that means. By way of background, he was born and grew up in India. His father was a civil servant and an economist with Marxist leanings. His mother was a Sanskrit professor. Satya himself was an avid cricket player and fan, so his room, picture this, as a child, had posters of Karl Marx, the Indian goddess Lakshmi, and the star of the Indian national cricket team. Satya later earned a master's at the University of Wisconsin right next door and an MBA at Booth right here in Chicago. On this latter point, I have some big news that you will only hear here tonight, which is, as of Friday, Satya was named to the Board of Trustees of the University of Chicago. Yay. He and I also served together on the Starbucks board, along with another Chicago native, Mary Dillon, who's sitting to his right. And there's one more Chicago connection that I have to mention. Penny Pritzker sits on the Microsoft board, another Chicago leader. Satya is married and the father of 3, including a son whose disabilities help foster his deep understanding of empathy and its power to realize a better future for all of us. Here to tell us more about all of this is Chief Executive Officer and my friend, Satya Nadella. But before we welcome him on stage, I'm going to offer a brief video about the history of Microsoft.
Where does inspiration come from? Where does innovation begin? Where does the future really start? Our story began in a dorm room in 1975 on a strip of paper. And from there, a vision was born. We designed technology to build, technology to grow, technology to learn, explore, and create. And we turned a world of possibility into a world of reality. But no journey is without obstacles. And our challenges only encouraged us to go further. This is a new chapter. With new frontiers, new possibilities, new obstacles, and a renewed passion and vision to face them all.
It is our mission to empower every person and organization on the planet to achieve more.
Well, we're very excited that you're here, and there's a lot to talk about. I want to start, the book is fascinating. It really is. I loved it. And there's something you say in the book that actually struck me as just the first thing I wanted to ask you about. You took over as CEO, and you write this line in the book. You say the company was sick. I was really stunned by that. The company was sick. We think of this powerful, successful business. You said there were a myriad of problems that you wanted to address right away: bureaucracy, internal politics, waning innovation, amongst lots of other things. How did it go wrong in your view? How did you get there to where you were sick? Because I think from the outside, that wasn't our perspective.
First of all, thank you so much for having me here and squeezing me in between Obama and Bono. So I feel, what can go wrong? It's an interesting thing. Only an insider perhaps could write that, because in some sense, I'm a consummate insider. I've grown up at Microsoft. Microsoft's pretty much all my professional life. And so all that is good and all that is bad, I'm part of it. So I cannot sort of talk and reflect on Microsoft at any point in time and somehow think of it as separate from me. The thing that I felt that had happened is when, for example, when I joined the company in '92, there was, we used to go around and say, hey, the mission of the company is to put a PC in every home and every desk. There was something just so simple, quantifiable, everything about that mission. I understood what I needed to do, so did everybody else who worked at the company at that time. And you could say, more or less by the end of the '90s, at least in the developed world, we, in some sense, achieved that mission. And ever since that time, I felt we were a little we were in search for what next? What is it? So that sense of purpose, which is sort of what I subsequently write a lot about, is what I get to. And that's kind of I feel any organization that doesn't have two things: a very strong grounding on that sense of purpose that makes everyone want to work there. And it can't be some abstract thing. It can't be. In fact, the thing I learned about our mission in '92 was it was a goal, a very audacious, bold goal, but it was not the sense of purpose or mission. And really trying to unpack that is what the quest for me was. But I felt, unless and until I get that foundation, And I always describe myself, especially, quite honestly, as a mere mortal CEO succeeding. You know, Steve was not a founder, but for all practical purposes, he had founder status. I mean, he and Bill built the company. And I realized that there's no way, and Steve's advice to me was that don't try to fill my shoes, be your own person. And I said I needed to grapple with the harsh reality of where we are as an insider, see it and own it, and then start working it.
So it's interesting, you asked a big question, and you say it's a question that everyone should ask themselves about their company as well as personally. So first, the big question for the company, why do we exist? I mean, that is a big question given the size and scale that you had at that point, where you posed that question to the senior leaders of your company and to yourself, why do we exist, in a quest to find your purpose, which is, it's hard to even imagine that you were grappling with this given the scale and the success that you had had. Why'd you ask that question, and how did you answer it?
Yeah. I mean, the reason I asked that question was I felt we were not defining who we are and what we want to achieve with the clarity that is needed in order to drive any kind of success. And what I mean by that is, I fundamentally believe, like any human being, companies have an identity, have a soul. That's how I think of it as, you know. And sometimes you get defined by what others think about you versus really having that inner strength of what is it that you can uniquely contribute. And so that was the simple. You can say, hey, you know, in Booth you would have said, oh, that's competitive differentiation. It's my mother's Sanskrit leanings that led me to the soul. But that's really how I think of it, which is unless and until I can answer the simplest basic question of why is it that Microsoft exists. And one of the things, the exercise we went through was, suppose we disappeared from the world. Will anybody miss us? Is there any sensibility that will be lost? And I tell you, that is what led me, this mission statement we now talk about, empowering every person and every organization on the planet to achieve more, is not just a set of words for us. Each word has deep meaning. For example, that notion that it's about people and it's institutions people build in order to even outlast them, to me is a first-class software construct. Everything I learned over my 28 years at Microsoft, I kind of get it. It's sort of intuitive. Anybody who works in the company knows that it's not just about people, it's about people trying to achieve something else in terms of the institution they're building. Global scale, I'm a product of that. I wouldn't have been in the United States, let alone at Microsoft or CEO of Microsoft. It was not for Microsoft technology reaching me where I grew up. So I've always sort of thought about that, and that's core to our mission. But the last piece is probably the most important element, which is the achieve more. If you think back, I always go back to the origin story, and even the video had that. It had that tape of the basic interpreter. Bill and Paul dropped out of college and built the basic interpreter for the Altair. That was the very first product. To me, in that product, the story behind that product is everything you need to ever know about Microsoft. That's who we are. We want to create technology so that others can create more technology. We are a tool builder, platform builder. That's one of the reasons why I wanted us to be comfortable in those shoes, not be defined by envy. In fact, one of the things I felt what was happening to us was we were looking around and saying, oh, what's the competition doing? Maybe it's important. You can learn from competition. You got to be grounded in a competitive reality, no question. But you can't be defined by it. And so to me, that's really how why I think about this identity and the notion of having a real sense of purpose or soul is so important.
I'm going to come back to competition because there were a lot of big learnings on partnerships and competition in the book. But I want to thread the needle a little bit more on soul. You said every company has a soul. Is that true? I mean, do you think that Microsoft always had a soul? I think there were times when people thought, maybe in some of the days of the government trial and things like that, that there was no soul. There was this fiercely competitive spirit, and there's some companies that definitely had that win at all costs, and I'm not saying that was Microsoft, but do you think all companies have a soul?
I mean, maybe at least I would claim that all companies have a real identity that has integrity. That in some sense, the only reason why, here's how I think about companies become successful when they're doing something useful for someone out there. And in there is inherent goodness. There is inherent sense of pride in the people who are doing it. And somehow capturing it, recapturing it. Because in some sense, I always say this, what happens to organizations, whether it is in ancient Greece or in modern Silicon Valley, it's one thing, which is if you're successful, hubris sets in, right, and you make mistakes. And the question is, how do you make sure that you don't fall, for those, and then you somehow get back to that story of what created you in the first place, what made you successful in the first place.
So I want to ask about that, because you talk about the fact that, okay, you had this cash cow, this business that was just throwing off so much cash to, embedded in all of our computers, and we're all renewing it regularly, et cetera. And you're saying to your leadership team, I want to focus on this tiny little thing that no one really knows about or has heard of. It's going to be big. It's called the cloud. And they're like, brushing you away. Why do you care? This can't move the needle. How do you get the troops to pivot like that when you have something that is working so well, you dominate, and you say, I want to shift the focus. We'll still do that, but these other things are going to be hugely important. How did you get that kind of buy-in?
I mean, in all honesty, all these transitions and whatever I've done, I learned at Microsoft. I mean, here's an interesting thing. When I joined in '92, we were a successful company. Here we are in 2018. We are in the fight, so to speak. And the only reason why I think we've been able to stay in whatever 43 years, and it's fascinating, every 5 years there's a new existential crisis at Microsoft, which is there is some new competitor who is going to kill us. And
does that make you better?
I think so. I mean, the fact that it's new every time, that makes us even better. So to me, that means we have in us the ability to reframe. And to think about, like one of the things in tech companies and in tech industries, and now it's probably relevant for everyone in any industries, it's unforgiving if you don't get the tech trends right. And it's long before there's conventional wisdom that this is the thing to do. You have to be all in and right, which is hard. And so to me, I think from inherent, and quite frankly, I got permission even before I became CEO. Steve was giving me the permission to be all in on this new business of ours. So I would say culturally, the company had taught me how to do these pivots. If anything, the only big difference was I also realized that we needed to focus. We needed to focus on a few things which we can uniquely do and contribute versus doing everything that perhaps was more defined by what our competition was doing.
So how do you do that? Because how do you prioritize? You have a $15 billion R&D budget. I mean, you have an enormous budget for innovation and experimentation, and you're experimenting and innovating in ways big and small all the time. Your budget is country GDPs. I mean, this is not a small thing. So how do you actually focus your priorities when you're doing something at that scale? Are you taking big bets, or is it like spray and play and pray? You hope things work out.
Look, I think it's a great question, because the risk, and there are other industries. In fact, it's the $15 billion piece is one thing that I try to learn from a lot of other people in terms of how does one allocate, because it's all high beta on a long-term horizon. We were talking even about quantum. I mean, it's just things that are, as I said, long before their conventional wisdom. You got to be all in. But here's the thing: I start with, before we think about allocation of budget, is there a worldview you have of where technology is growing and going? So it's super important to get that right. Then I think there is a way to manage that portfolio of investments, which I sort of term as no regret moves. There are ways you can be building. If you look at Microsoft today, pretty much there's a central thesis, whether it's Xbox and what we're trying to do with subscriptions, or what we're doing with Office 365, or what we describe as Microsoft 365, or our business applications, or data and AI, all of them are centered on one core set of innovation around our cloud infrastructure, and AI breakthroughs. So we pick, even the acquisitions we have done, are all got that same central thesis, whether it's LinkedIn or the pending GitHub acquisition. So to me, being smart about, capital allocation, one of the things that I did learn at Booth was capital allocation. And I'm pretty disciplined about it, which is, in some sense, I want us to be really doing things that we truly can uniquely do versus being defined by other metrics.
So Warren Buffett says the real sign of a CEO is capital allocation. That's one of the greatest skills that you can have. Are your teammates coming in pitching you on ideas where you have to be all-knowing, or are you seeding a certain amount of money to individuals to decide? How does that work?
Well, we definitely, I wish I was all-knowing, but I'm far from that. But, absolutely. One of the things that we changed a lot, like the other transition for me was, if you think about Steve, he probably saw, 4 management teams come and go in his tenure. And so he had it all, and he could keep it all. There was no way I was going to be able to do it. And so therefore, it was very important for us to be a team. And, so we really, in fact, the senior leadership team at Microsoft meets every Friday. We spend real time.
How many people are in that
It's
group?
around 11 people.
Every Friday?
Every Friday. And we're in there every Friday, looking at it left to right. One of the things I realized was, and in fact, Steve had said this to me, which is, God, at some point I'm not going to be here. I hope you all know the left to right business. And most of us looked at each other and said, no, we don't. Because we had never sort of really, we were all running our businesses, but we had not thought about Microsoft as one whole. To me, that was super important to bring the team together. And having a central thesis, in fact, the framework I have is you got to have a worldview, you got to have a set of ambitions, and then you can unpack the specifics. And so in terms of allocation of resources, I don't go into the detail at all, because if anything, as long as you got the top direction set, we have a fantastic set of leaders who are very capable of being able to run these businesses.
So you have one of the greatest minds of all time at your disposal, which is Bill Gates. He is a genius. Few would disagree with that. What have you learned from him?
With Bill? I always used to say at Microsoft, we have one amazing great advantage. It is that we have Bill Gates. And then we have one big disadvantage. We have people who run around at Microsoft thinking they're Bill Gates. and to know the real Bill Gates is the one person I've met who has the most intellectual honesty amongst anybody. He'll attack every idea of yours, but if you push back and you're right, he'll be the first to admit.
So you have to be able to withstand.
You got to be able to withstand.
Right?
That was like, but both Bill and Steve were like that, which is they were always just, curious, intellectually honest. They would put you through, the ringer in terms of being just on top of your game. But at the same time, it was not, they were not passing judgment on you. They were just really trying to test themselves as much as you. And to me, at least, it's very refreshing. Once you get used to it, I would say, to me, Bill's the easiest person to go in and have a conversation, get an honest opinion about what I'm doing, and then come out of it with more clarity.
Can you teach yourself to be intellectually honest, or you think you just come at things that way if you're that kind of person?
I ask myself that, and I think it comes from, many people in this room probably have this, which is, I think it comes from having that innate confidence about being able to do things, learn, be wrong, and it's okay. That's, I think, where the intellectual honesty comes from. When you're wrong, and wrong badly, can you step back and say, yeah, I got that wrong, and here are all the reasons, and can you go in and unpack that? Because sometimes, believe me, there are times when I don't want to go look at that. But that's what I think intellectual honesty comes from. And especially as leaders, I'm learning intellectual honesty about what is going right, what is not going right, and being grounded on it is so much more important than a lot of other things that people attribute to leaders.
I think it's interesting that you related confidence to being wrong, understanding when you're wrong, because I think most people get their confidence from being right.
Yeah.
When have you been wrong?
Oh, plenty.
When it mattered, and that your intellectual honesty had to push you to understand that.
I mean, let's take even what my comments at Grace Hopper were perhaps one of the most...
Which you talk about in the book.
Yeah, so for example, I was at the Women's Tech Conference, I think in '95, perhaps, and then I was asked a question as to what advice would I have for any woman who did not want to ask for a pay rise. And I just kind of completely gave a nonsensical answer. And where it came from was essentially I sprung my own personal experience on, as an answer to the question, which is so deep-seated. Here I am at a women's conference without understanding the context. I mean, even the question, as I think about it, the layers I've learned since then, it's just amazing. It's like, I don't want to ask for a raise. What should I do? I've had to learn since then. For example, now if I had to answer, I'd say, yeah, let's, in fact, have male allies, female allies. First of all, advocate for yourself. But if you don't want to ask, have somebody else champion. And that is what Maria Clave so rightfully explained. But I had not known that.
Right.
But I learned that. I'm so much better off having learned that.
Which was interesting, because you got it wrong, and then you admitted to the whole company, I blew this, because you got raked over the coals publicly for the comments that you made. It's fair to say.
And rightfully so, yeah.
It's interesting because you answered the question from your perspective, and I think the women did not feel that it was a robust answer. Again, acknowledged your mistake. I found it interesting because you talk so much about empathy. It's a cornerstone of so much of your conversation in the book and your beliefs about running the company. And somehow you got the empathy wrong on that question. Tell us why you think empathy is so important, and give us the story of where your real sense of empathy came from.
I mean, it's interesting. To me, in fact, in the book, as I was writing it, I reflected on it. A lot of my moments are all when I have learned the most when I've gotten things wrong so badly. Even some of the things which, as trivial as the last question of my interview loop at Microsoft. And it was like, it's a classic 8 hours of interviews, and they get you to go on the board and write algorithms for 8 hours. And I was so tired by the end of it all. And so this last interviewer says, you know what, I have one last question for you. You're standing on the crossroads. A baby has just fallen and is crying. What would you do? And here I am after 8 hours thinking, God, I didn't learn that in computer science school. It must be some complex algorithm that I missed. And I sort of thought about it for a while. And then I said, you know what, I'll get to the closest phone booth. This was obviously pre-cell phone era. And call 911. The interviewer, who works, by the way, at Starbucks right now, so he gets up, he walks out, and he walks me out, and he says, you should develop some empathy. Because when a baby falls, you pick them up and hug them. and I said, that was it. There's no way I'm going to make it to Microsoft. I might as well. In fact, that was an interesting time because I was deciding whether to go full-time to University of Chicago or go to work. And I said, yeah, my decisions are made. I'm done. But, interesting enough, I did get the job.
And you sort of did okay with him, it seems like.
But it is. It's the same thing. It's the same thing when my son was born, right? So
I was going to say, it's interesting that empathy story traces to a child because your center comes from that.
Yeah, in fact, that was another real, both my wife and I were the only children of our parents. And, in my late 20s, we had our first son. And, if you'd asked me just even the night before our son was born, what is on top of my mind, I would have said, how do we think about, care for him when Anu goes back to work and and so on. And we were not just, it'll be a normal delivery and everything will be fine, except everything changed that night for us. And he was born with sort of severe asphyxiation, which led to cerebral palsy. But the thing that really I struggled with so much more, and in fact, it was my wife's, I would say, deep sense of empathy that comes from being a mother, watching her. It was not as if she was even schooling me, but she schooled me by just her own behavior. That nothing happened to me, because for the longest time it was like, what happened to my plans, what happened to me, and what happened to us? And then I realized that nothing happened to me. In fact, if anything, my son needs help, and I as a parent and as a father need to step up. And I must say that when I got it, I could have probably intellectually understood it, but getting it as a father of a child with disabilities was sort of life-changing for me. And quite frankly, I learned that from my wife, because she got it instantly. She was the one driving him to all therapies, trying to give him the best shot. And since then, I think, empathy, you could say, is very good in the personal life, very important, but I think it's central to business. If you sort of say innovation comes, or when you want to build a product or a service that is going to meet the unmet, unarticulated needs of customers, your best shot of being able to do that is to have that deep sense of empathy. So that, that ability to see others. And that's why I think that it's so important for us to not separate out what we think is important at work, what we think is important for us in life. And if you can somehow bring the two things together, and empathy is one such very powerful thing that I've found to be very useful for me.
Some people say empathy is on the wane,
yeah,
which is an interesting thing, because we're more connected than we ever have been before, but we're less empathetic in some ways because our connection is technological as opposed to human. Do you agree with that?
I mean, there is a real issue of being completely, all human interaction being mediated by technology. I think there is a real issue there, which is...
Issue, good, bad, indifferent,
I think
or just...
it's bad if overdone. The classic thing that we all know, in fact, let's face it, at my home when we are having dinner, there are no phones, there are no devices. And I think it's important. It's sort of a very key thing for us as a family to come together, to be able to look each other in the eye, to be able to listen to each other, to have that connection, which I think is what is so important for us. It gives us the source of inspiration, the energy, the courage. So I think that, but at the same time, that doesn't mean we should all sort of be troglodytes and sort of not use technology. If anything, I think technology can also help make connections. I'm not even denying that. But as a tech CEO, I think, I'm optimistic about technology, but at the same time, I'm grounded on the unintended consequences of overuse of any tech.
How did your mother figure into this? Because you talk about, when I think of when you talking about connections, you wrote about your mother in incredibly loving ways. And what was fascinating to me that you said your mother only cared that you were happy. Yeah. That was her thing. It wasn't about you being successful. It wasn't, she constantly asked you if you were happy.
Yeah, it's just, my mother is, passed away a few years ago. And as I've thought more and more about her and how, in particular, her influence on me has been tremendous. My father and my mother were, as I write in the book, my father, as you mentioned, was a Marxist economist, a civil servant. And my mother was a Sanskrit professor, and they couldn't agree on much, and so...
And you're like the ultimate capitalist. That's
right.
It's fascinating.
My mother would have been happy. My father, he still thinks that, what am I doing? But that said, the thing that both of them did do was give me confidence in their own way. My father, I think, had this real intellectual curiosity about things. So a lot of what I do nowadays in terms of the love for new ideas, which has been super helpful as a tech CEO or as a person who worked in the technology industry, comes from him. But my mother gave me, I think, the most important set of lessons, which led to real foundational confidence in being able to deal with life as it happens, which is be grounded at all times. Be present in what is happening around you. And that's that source of that question. The only thing she would ask me, are you happy? And I used to get very irritated in the beginning. What does it mean? I don't know. But to her, that was the only thing that mattered. I remember, I got some very bad test scores once, and then she asked me, are you happy? And I said, what? Don't you think you should be unhappy for me too? And she said, no. And so there's a lot about her, which I think she was trying to teach me in her own ways, just that ability to be comfortable in your own shoes and be present. And that's been, perhaps more than anything else, the most valuable lesson I could have learned.
You did not expect to be the CEO. You didn't think you would be picked. No one knew. And you get a call one night from John Thompson, who's the chair of the board, saying, it's you, and you're blown away. Why did they pick you, do you think? I remember one of the things, look, when the process was pretty open, Penny was not in the board at that time, but the process for the board did say that they're going to go out and look far and wide, both internally and externally. And at one point during that, I didn't even realize that they were going to even look internally. In fact, the day Steve announced, most of us thought that there will be some CEO that will come from the outside. And so at some point they said, hey, who are the people inside who can be CEOs? And they talked to a few of us. And I was asked that question by a board member and saying, do you want to be CEO? I said, only if you want me to be a CEO. And I remember, him saying to me, but no, CEOs don't answer questions like that. If you want to be a CEO, you got to say, I want to be a CEO. And I thought about it, and I said, but only if you want me to. And then, but interestingly enough, I went and reflected on this with Steve, and I told him that this is what happened. And Steve said, yeah, it's too late to change. That's who you are. And that gave me a lot of confidence. He said, hey, it doesn't matter, don't worry. It's not that, flubbing the interview question. I don't know. Quite honestly, I think that this debate of internal versus external is a real one, and for all the right reasons. But I felt that I had a worldview of what I wanted to do with Microsoft going forward. What does it mean to me, a leader? Which was, in fact, I go back to the first piece of email I wrote in 2014. And pretty much that's how we have run. I've changed a few things here and there in terms of where we are going, who we are, that sense of purpose, culture, the strategy. How much of it do you think was vision about the business and making money and continuing on the growth trajectory? And how much of it was your emotional intelligence and your views on soul and empathy and culture? You said the C in CEO is culture. How much was that?
I don't know how to separate the two, quite honestly. I don't know how one leads a company if you don't have EQ. In fact, I'm on record saying this, which is I would any day pick EQ over IQ. Because I think that without it, you may even get a few things right, but you'll get most things wrong.
But most people don't equate engineers with high EQ. That's not a knock. It just, you don't come away with that feeling of they want to give you a hug.
I think it comes in different forms, I would say.
A computer hug with an emoji?
Yeah, that's right. But I do believe, like, for example, there's a book I remember reading growing up, in fact, a little bit of the soul of a company, It was called The Soul of a Machine by Tracy Kidder. It was about a development team that was trying to build, I think, Data General's computer in the mid-'80s or early '80s. And it was a fantastic read because the book was so much about the leader, the human emotions of that team, so much of great projects, right? Whether it's the Apollo project or I remembered so distinctly Windows NT. We're going to celebrate, I think, the 25th year, in this Saturday of Windows NT, and I so distinctly remember how teams had to come together. The leaders who were able to make the impossible possible were all people who had a deep sense of empathy, who had a deep sense of how to make people do things which were not naturally possible. And there are different styles, I will admit. In tech, we have lots of different styles. But I felt that it was very, very important to be able to get, like one of the things my test ultimately for Microsoft is, can I turn the contract, which is instead of saying you work for Microsoft, can anybody who walks into Microsoft, not just the CEO, can somehow say, no, Microsoft works for me, which is I have a personal philosophy, a passion, a community that I serve, and somehow Microsoft helps me achieve that. I'm not saying it's going to be even. I'm not sort of, so not grounded in the realities, I know. But the thing is, even if it does it 5%, 10% of the time, think about it, right? One of the greatest pleasures I have as CEO of Microsoft is to go to any community, like even today in Chicago, to be able to see a small business that got productive because of what we do, a public sector institution that's more efficient, a large multinational that is more competitive, entrepreneurs we are supporting, non-profit organizations we are supporting. That is what we can do at scale. And so to be able to construct that platform, I think is what is super important.
So I have to ask, because you talked about soul of a company, and it led to soul of technology. I want to pivot to AI, artificial intelligence, because the big fear with artificial intelligence is the soul goes away and the computer runs the world and it has no empathy and it has no emotion. Why are some people wrong about that? And how important is artificial intelligence and machine learning going to be to the future of our society and the future of Microsoft?
First of all, I think the defining technology of our times is clearly going to be AI and machine learning. I would come at it in two ways. One is, let's just think about what AI can do for us as we sit here in 2018, in terms of, in fact, bringing more people to fully participate in our society, in our economy. One of the things that I'm very passionate about is accessibility. And if you think about some of the AI breakthroughs and what I'm seeing today, because of what is possible, we incorporated into Word and into Edge and OneNote, all of our tools that people use to read, something called learning tools. So anybody who has dyslexia, right, can now read. They improve their reading performance. And especially the thing that is so important about reading performance in primary school is it defines everything going forward. So AI can, in fact, sort of really make it possible for someone with disabilities to fully participate. We worked with, in fact, Steve Gleason, and now in Windows, we put in something called the eye gaze technology. So if you have ALS, the only views you have is of your eye gaze, and you can use that to type and communicate. We have even done magical things with computer vision with this thing called Seeing AI. Or the Xbox controller. One of the things that I feel so, we just launched it, is the Xbox adaptive controller that allows anybody to play games, and there's sort of this thing called the co-pilot in Xbox. So it's magical. So technology, and particularly AI technology, can in fact be used to get more people to get benefits, to participate, get the economic opportunity they deserve. Now, having said all that, going back to your point about soul, and I mean, whether it's the technological displacement, which is a real challenge, which I think is a solvable thing, because there's always, if there's only return on capital and no return on labor, I think history has taught us that there are solutions that are policy-based. But the thing about what I worry about and what I need to, as a technology CEO, do something about is, how do we make AI a more robust engineering field? That's what I think about. Think about it. When a bridge falls today, we look at it and say, wow, that's like, what are the construction faults? We can go back, study it, we can analyze it, the engineering depth we have to be able to analyze what caused any bridge to fall. We need that level of rigor if we're going to use something like AI, like bridges in the real life. That means if they're going to impact lives, you need to be, for example, bias. You've got to know that you're introducing some AI model that is fundamentally not biased. And these are unsolved problems.
So there need to be rules of engagement? Do they need to be universal rules, international rules? How should that work?
It's a great question. So I think maybe 2 years ago, in that other book that is available to you as well, we tried to sort of put this all together. I first started by saying, let us have some design principles which can guide us. So for example, at Microsoft, we are very much grounded on the fact that with AI, human is in the loop. So I believe abdicating responsibility for AI and its decision-making too early is very dangerous. So you got to design systems. If you're creating AI systems that are making automated decisions, then the person who is building that system is in the loop, so therefore they have the responsibility to go figure out how to make sure that the AI system is going to make the right decisions. It's something that is, you can go introspect, understand, and if it's made a mistake, can you go back and fix the mistake? So yes, I think there's design principles. There is, I think, regulation that's definitely needed.
Does the world agree with you? Like if we're in China and have this conversation, would they say, yes, let's collaborate with Microsoft and America on this? Is there consensus?
I think that AI ethics is definitely something that is universally recognized, whether it's in China, whether it's in the United States, whether it's in Europe. And that's where I think we will have to do our best work as a global community, so that we can take the benefits of these amazing, amazing breakthroughs in technologies, but have an understanding that these technologies can have unintended consequences. So I'm, quite frankly, an optimist in that we are getting a fresh start. Unlike the climate or in many other places, the understanding of the unintended consequences is better, while we are still in the very early stages. I'm not one of those who thinks that we are at the stage of AI where we are going to have AGI anytime soon. We have some magical breakthroughs, but we are so far from common sense reasoning that I think we have time on our side if we focus.
But what happens if you break the rules? Or let's just use one of my husband's favorite words, the dark side. There's a side of the world that is not about playing fair and is trying to exploit bad things to hurt people.
That's right.
Or to gain at the expense of others. So how do you, who is the arbiter?
Yeah, no, I mean, so look, take even what's happening in the cyber world today. I mean, it's fascinating to see, while we talk about AI, one of the things that every day, every organization has to deal with is cybercrime, and with nation states even. And so,
do you worry about it?
I absolutely do. And
should we be worried?
So I'll give you a couple of things. I mean, if you sort of, there are multiple ways. We should all be worried, but the question for me, of course, is what am I doing about it? And we recently launched something for just email phishing called Account Guard. And the way it came about was very interesting. There's this group called Strontium that many of you probably recognize sort of who's behind it, but there's this group that we've been tracking for many, many years. And we realized that they were infiltrating by regular social engineering, using some domains, a couple of our senators, and some think tanks, political think tanks on the Republican side. And so we noticed it, And we then were able to capture the domains that were being used for phishing. And in order to do that, in fact, what really we have now more than any product is I'll call it the operational security posture. Given what we see, we essentially go to fight on behalf of all the businesses that we serve and all the users we serve to make sure that they're secure. So we even had to come up with a legal process so that we can get hold of these domains, transfer them over to us with speed, and then make sure that we were blackholing all the traffic that was going to these phishing sites. Another case which is fascinating, nowadays, for example, the cyber attacks is this is more cyber criminal, not nation state, but it was more a small business in Johnson City, Tennessee, population, I think, 40,000, precision attack, right? Again, very similar to phishing, and we were able to detect it on first sight. This is AI, by the way. Like, we can't have, like, this is a fascinating question of what AI can do to help us, where the AI literally saw the malware and the model that was running made the decision, and it helped protect that small business. So to me, I think what we have to do is really build the engineering rigor, the technology the paradigm, so that we can, in fact, get the benefits and mitigate the unintended consequences, whether it's crime or bias or anything else.
So I've got a few minutes left for some really hard subjects, and I'm going to try to go quickly through them. This is so unfair. Quantum computing. Seriously. So give us like the elevator speech of what it is. Elevator, regular people, not engineers and PhDs, and why it's important in terms of who gets there first.
Yeah, this is the one area that even Bill said you should go find someone else to explain it to you. It is the only area. Look, here's the fascinating thing, right? Which is, here we are in 2018, we talk about technology, how we have so much computing power. I mean, the cloud, it's just phenomenal. Even for me, as someone who grew up, it was there day one of the Microsoft cloud, to see what we have today. It's just like unimaginable. Everything I learned about distributed computing is being rewritten. It's just the foundational physics. But having said all that, there are so many computational problems that are unsolvable today with all the computational power. Like literally, like take the climate change problem. We're all looking for that miracle solution, right? So is there some enzyme or catalyst that can absorb carbon? That's a quantum problem. That is something that requires a quantum computer to solve. So, and same thing in food production. What's that enzyme that is really at the core of food production? Another quantum problem. A lot of these security things can be quantum problems. So then you say, okay, is there a paradigm? It's interesting. For all the change in computing over all these years, we're still captive to basically one foundational architecture, which comes from von Neumann, and we are still basically using the same architecture. We've sped things up. We know how to do many things which are smart around that architecture. But quantum comes at it very differently. The simplest way I learned to think about the computational sort of solve here is, let's say you had one of those classic corn maze things, and you wanted to get through, and you hit an obstacle, then you retrace, then go back. That's how a classical computer will solve it. Whereas a quantum computer will just take all the paths all the time simultaneously. And so you can imagine how you can get to a solution a lot faster. And so we have gone, in fact, we have a Fields Medal winner in math. We have some physics folks who are doing foundational work around superconducting, and computer science, because the computer science stack that I learned in school is just completely useless, and we'll now need to sort of build a complete new stack. And interestingly enough, here is a thing. We put a simulator on Azure for building quantum algorithms last year. And I was thinking, well, who will sort of use the quantum simulator? It turns out Cleveland Clinic folks were one of the first groups to come in, because some doctor at Cleveland Clinic had come up with some new fingerprinting techniques for MRIs. and didn't have enough computational power to be able to solve for what he thought would be early diagnosis of something like cancer while just going through a first a run of the MRI. And so they said, I'm going to test my algorithm out. And they're able to now use the algorithm simulator in some sense. And so I'm very optimistic. We have many, many pit stops before full quantum, which we are also very, very excited.
Your lifetime or not?
I think so, for sure. I think that the hardest challenge is the general purpose quantum computer. There is this thing called, I think of it as more of a gimmick, called quantum supremacy, which is essentially trying to solve one narrow thing by just saying, hey, we now are able to do something that no classical computer can do. But what is a general purpose quantum computer requires a lot more engineering and stabilization of these qubits. But I do believe in our lifetimes.
So we got AI, we got quantum computing. Those are two hard ones. Some people say this revolution that we're going through right now, this fourth industrial revolution, is a jobless revolution. And technology is getting whacked on this, saying that technology is taking away jobs. It's not globalization, it's technology. Is that right?
Here's a couple of things. One is a little bit of what I said about, hey, let's first recognize that some of this technology can in fact make it possible for many of us to find jobs. So for that kid with dyslexia to get better at reading, will have better outcomes and get a job. Or someone with visual impairment to be able to fully participate at Microsoft because of the tools. So that's sort of one piece. The second piece is clearly, if any technological displacement happens, the first thing we should do is do a fantastic job of what I would call finding the new jobs that they can be qualified for or get the retraining for. And this is one of the places where I'm very optimistic about taking, let's say, the LinkedIn signal. One of the reasons why I was excited about LinkedIn is it's really an economic graph. The ability to see what jobs are out there, what skills are required as a real-time feedback cycle. From what I've learned, a lot of reskilling programs have this one foundational disadvantage, which is they're done in a vacuum, which is you don't have a real economic feedback cycle. So I think we will have to, some of the social programs, programs inside companies, organizations like LinkedIn will all have to contribute, but we will probably have to do some of the best work of essentially creating that marketplace mechanism for retraining, because that's going to be real, which is many of us will have to retrain ourselves multiple times perhaps in our professional careers to be able to be relevant as technology shifts. Now, let's even go to the extreme case of technological displacement. And then I would say, this is where my labor versus capital argument comes in, which is someone somewhere is making a lot of money because the capital is getting all the return, right? It's like in this fully automated world. So the question is, what is the wage support we can provide for a lot of jobs that may not be considered high-wage jobs today? Again, I go back to my own personal experience. I always think, I was reading this book called Squeezed recently. I forget the name of the author. Fascinating book about the number of people who have a tough time staying in the middle class because they get dropped from it by just one hit. And these are people who are in the middle class today, but let's say a woman who has just was pregnant, had a child, had some issues, gets into debt, gets out of a job, and then you're off, and then it's tough to come back. But to me, if we can start saying, look, there is more, like one of the things we just did was paternity leave for the contractors who work at Microsoft. We need more wage support that needs to be propagated across the society, across the economy for jobs so that people can, in fact, even when they're being technologically displaced, find jobs and get the support. Like healthcare, and for example, take the amount of elder care people with empathy, right? I'm not, maybe robots will have empathy, that's great, but humans who show up, who are empathetic towards us at the time of our need, will need wage support. Teachers will need wage support. So I think that there are real solutions, but we will have to do some of our best policy work, best work as an industry, and we'll have to walk the walk. And that's why I'm sort of really happy to see us take these steps around whether it's the paid leave or parental leave, which are so important.
Two last questions. So the next one, some people say technology is squeezing people out, and there's another narrative that immigrants are squeezing people out of jobs. You're an immigrant. How do you feel about the rhetoric around immigrants in the world? It's not just an American story, it's a story of immigrants, migrants, is a subject of conversation in Europe, here, and in other places.
Yeah, here's, I mean, I obviously come at it from just my personal story, and it's sort of hard not to sort of reflect on this issue. I can't sort of separate out my own story. I mean, I always say this, I'm a product of two amazing American things. One is American technology reaching me where I was growing up, letting me even dream the dream. And it was the enlightened American immigration policy that let me come here and thrive. I mean, it's just, I'm ever grateful for both of those. And I think whether it's in the United States, in Europe, or anywhere else, I think we have to come at this. Let's take the US in particular. I'll make the following argument. I'll make the argument that immigration is good for our competitiveness. That's the argument I'll make. One is, think about it, right? Take DACA. If we show our humanity, really, in solving that issue, our standing in the world will be so much more. And America has always stood for it, right? Which is people who most need hope have found it in this place. And so to me, always stand for it, I think is our competitive advantage. That's our position. The second thing is, take immigrants like myself. We've come here, we've sort of contributed, and again, that leads to competitive advantage of the United States, to be able to attract the talent. That doesn't mean we shouldn't have real checks and balances. Every country, the borders matter. I'm not someone who says that, this is all about anybody goes anywhere. I also think that creating local opportunities, job number one, no question. In fact, one of the other programs we are very sort of thrilled about is the rural broadband work we're doing, because it's so true. Unless and until we can make sure that, let's say, take any veteran who comes back, many of them go back to where they came from, which is rural America, and guess what? Right next to our biggest data centers, there is no high-speed internet. And if you even wanted to get access to VA, you need to drive.
Right.
So we will need to create economic opportunity locally for the people who are here. That is job number one. But I don't think that should take away from us being able to think about immigration as something that is, in fact, making us stronger, not weaker.
My last question in our last seconds. Let's pretend it's your last day and you're closing the door behind you. What do you hope to have accomplished?
It's a great one. And in fact, I've thought about that because Steve got me thinking about it. He says there's only one thing that you got to be thinking about, which is, did the person who comes after you, will they achieve more success than you? And as long as you think about that's the place you leave, then you've got something right. But it was a great way. Like, I look at it, a lot of leaders sometimes sort of look at it and sort of say, oh yeah, I came in and I fixed everything. And he says, be suspicious of it. Because in some sense, someone will come through the door someday. Always think about what is it that person can do. Even if they said that about you, where they're more successful. Celebrate your successor's success was actually a great sort of lesson, at least I inferred from how sort of, even Steve talked to me about his own time at Microsoft.
Ladies and gentlemen, Satya Nadella.